The moment I signed that contract, everyone in the room believed I had just secured the future of my empire. They were wrong. The smallest detail in the entire agreement was the thing that nearly changed everything. I still remember the sound of the pen touching the paper. A quiet click. A simple movement. Yet every person standing around that marble conference table treated it like a declaration. The deal was worth millions, built over months of negotiations, reviewed by attorneys, financial advisors, and people whose entire careers depended on finding mistakes before they reached my desk. I was Vincent Moretti. For years, I had built my reputation on seeing what others missed. I trusted numbers. I trusted preparation. I trusted control. That night, I believed I had all three. The private dining room at the top of the Manhattan building was filled with soft conversations and expensive suits. Outside the glass walls, the city lights moved like a river beneath us. Everyone wanted my approval. Everyone wanted the final signature. And I gave it. The agreement was called perfect. No risks. No weaknesses. No unanswered questions. At least, that was what everyone told me. I noticed Emma Carter because she was the only person in that room who was not trying to impress me. She was carrying coffee, taking notes for the event staff, and quietly doing the job most people would never notice. She was a waitress. She was not part of the negotiations. She was not supposed to understand the language inside those documents. She was not supposed to have an opinion about a business deal that had taken months to complete. But Emma had something most people around me had forgotten how to use. She paid attention. I first saw it when she stopped near the table after the meeting had ended. Everyone else was celebrating. Glasses were raised. Phones were already ringing with news of the agreement. But Emma looked down at the folder I had just signed. Not with curiosity. With concern. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried enough confidence to make the room become quiet. I looked at her. Most people avoided interrupting me. Emma did not. "I think there is something you should see before this becomes official." A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. One of my advisors smiled politely, almost as if he was waiting for me to dismiss her. I almost did. Almost. Because everything about the moment told me she was out of place. But something in her expression stopped me. She was not seeking attention. She was not trying to prove anything. She looked like someone who had found something important and understood the weight of staying silent. "What did you find?" I asked. Emma opened the folder carefully and pointed to one small section near the bottom of a page. A line most people would have ignored. A detail buried among thousands of words. "This number doesn't match the previous document," she said. I thought maybe it was intentional, but if it is not, the entire agreement changes. The room became still. I picked up the paper and looked closer. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw it. The tiny detail everyone had missed. A small inconsistency hidden inside a perfect deal. And for the first time that night, I felt something I hated feeling. Doubt. Not because Emma had challenged me. But because she had seen something that I had not. The woman everyone overlooked had noticed the one thing the most powerful people in the room failed to catch. I looked at the contract again. Then I looked at Emma. "How did you notice this?" I asked. She simply answered, "Because nobody was looking at it anymore. Everyone was too busy believing it was perfect." Those words stayed with me. Because in that moment, I realized the biggest mistake I had made was not missing the detail. It was believing I was the only person capable of finding it. I knew something was wrong the moment everyone started defending a document they had not truly examined. That was the part one could not ignore. In my world, confidence was often mistaken for certainty, and certainty was often mistaken for truth. But Emma Carter had introduced a question into a room where nobody wanted questions. After the meeting ended, I stayed behind with the contract in my hand while the city continued moving below the windows. My advisors gathered around me, each one offering a different reason why Emma's concern was probably nothing. They spoke about experience. They spoke about reputation. They spoke about the amount of time that had already been invested. What they did not speak about was the detail she had found. I had spent years learning how people behaved when they were protecting their own interests. I knew when someone was hiding information. I knew when someone was trying to control a conversation. But Emma was different. She had nothing to gain from interrupting a room full of powerful people. In fact, she had more to lose. The easiest choice for her would have been to stay silent, finish her shift, and walk away. Instead, she stepped forward. That bothered me more than I expected. Not because she challenged my decision, but because I respected the reason behind it. The next morning, I asked my legal team to review the section Emma pointed out. I did not tell them why. I simply asked them to look again. At first, they found nothing unusual. Then one of the attorneys stopped speaking. The room became quiet in a way I recognized. It was the silence people created when they realized a problem was bigger than they wanted to admit. The number Emma noticed was connected to a clause that affected the structure of the agreement. A small inconsistency. A single line. A detail that looked meaningless unless someone knew exactly where to look. My advisors immediately started discussing possible explanations, but I was no longer listening the same way. I kept thinking about Emma standing there in that expensive room surrounded by people who had more education, more experience, and more authority than she did. Yet she was the one who noticed. I found her later that afternoon at the restaurant where she worked. It was not the kind of place someone like me usually visited. It was simple. Warm lights. Small tables. The sound of coffee machines and conversations filling the air. Emma looked surprised when she saw me. "Did something happen?" she asked. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Most people expected me to enter a room and make everyone adjust to me. Emma did not. She just waited for the truth. "You were right," I said. Her expression changed slightly, but she did not celebrate. She did not smile like she had won. She only nodded. I was hoping I was wrong. That answer stayed with me. Because it told me something about her character. She was not searching for a mistake. She was trying to prevent one. "Why did you look at that page?" I asked. Emma picked up a cup and placed it carefully on the counter. "Because everyone kept talking about how perfect everything was," she said. "Sometimes when people are certain something cannot fail, they stop checking if it can." I had heard thousands of intelligent statements in my life. I had listened to experts, strategists, and people who built careers around giving advice. But those simple words felt different. They were not designed to impress me. They were simply true. That night, I made a decision. I would find out how that detail was missed. Not because Emma had embarrassed my team. Not because my reputation was at risk. I wanted to know how a room full of people trained to see problems had overlooked the one thing that mattered most. And for the first time in years, I was not searching for an enemy. I was searching for the blind spot inside my own system. The hardest thing about finding a hidden problem is not discovering it. It is accepting that the problem existed because everyone believed they were too careful to miss it. That was the thought that followed me through the next several days. The agreement was no longer just a business decision. It had become a reflection of every person involved, including me. I returned to the office before sunrise. The city was still quiet, and the glass walls around my office reflected a man who had built his life around control. My team arrived one by one. Files were opened. Reports were reviewed. Every detail was examined again. This time, nobody assumed perfection. That was the difference. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became that Emma had not simply noticed a random mistake. She had recognized a pattern. The numbers were slightly adjusted in a way that made the agreement appear more balanced than it actually was. It was not obvious. It was designed to disappear among hundreds of pages of information. That realization changed the atmosphere around me. People who had been confident the day before were suddenly careful with their words. I noticed the hesitation in their voices. I noticed how quickly they searched for explanations. Years of experience had taught me that people often reveal more when they are trying to prove they did nothing wrong. I called Emma back to the office. This time, she did not look nervous. She walked into the room carrying the same calm expression she had the first night. She did not act like someone entering a place where she did not belong. She acted like someone who understood that truth did not depend on status. "I need you to explain exactly what you saw," I said. Emma looked at the documents on the table. "I did not understand the entire agreement," she admitted. "But I understood the way people were reacting to it." I watched her carefully. "What does that mean?" She pointed at the pages. Everyone was looking for reasons to approve it. Nobody was looking for reasons it could fail. That sentence stayed in the room longer than either of us expected. Because it was not an accusation. It was an observation. And that made it harder to dismiss. For the first time, I started seeing the situation from a different angle. The mistake was not only hidden in the paperwork. It was hidden in the mindset of everyone who reviewed it. Including me. Later that evening, I met with the people responsible for preparing the agreement. Questions were asked. Answers were given. Some explanations made sense. Others did not. But the most important discovery was not about the contract itself. It was about trust. I had built my organization by choosing people I believed were reliable. Now I had to face the possibility that reliability without honesty was just another form of risk. Emma was not part of that world. She did not know the rules people followed inside my circles. She did not know which names carried influence or which conversations happened behind closed doors. But she knew something simple. If something felt wrong, it deserved another look. That evening, I found her finishing her shift at the restaurant. She was wiping down a table near the window when she saw me. "You came back," she said. I nodded. "I needed to ask you something." She waited. "Why did you care enough to say something?" Emma paused. She looked outside at the street for a moment before answering. "Because if I saw something that could hurt people and stayed quiet, I would have to live with that choice." It was a simple answer. But simple answers are often the ones people avoid. I had spent years surrounded by people who measured everything by profit, influence, and advantage. Emma measured things differently. She measured them by consequences. And that difference was beginning to change the way I saw her. Not as someone who found a mistake in my deal. But as someone who reminded me that even the most powerful person in the room could still miss what mattered. I used to believe that the most dangerous mistakes were the ones people made without thinking. I was wrong. The most dangerous mistakes were the ones people made while they were certain they were right. After Emma showed me what everyone else missed, I started looking at my own organization differently. Not with suspicion. With awareness. That difference mattered. The days that followed were filled with meetings, reviews, and conversations that revealed more than any document ever could. I watched people who had always spoken with confidence suddenly choose their words carefully. I watched experts who had once treated every decision as obvious begin asking questions they should have asked from the beginning. The agreement was still sitting on my desk, but it no longer looked like a symbol of success. It looked like a reminder that confidence could become a weakness when nobody challenged it. Emma had changed the way I looked at the room around me. She had not done it by demanding attention. She had done it by noticing what everyone else ignored. That was something I could not forget. A week after the discovery, I invited Emma to a private meeting. She arrived at my office wearing the same simple uniform she wore during her shifts. She looked completely out of place among the polished furniture, the city view, and the people who usually filled that space. But somehow, she was the person who seemed the most comfortable. "You know, most people would have ignored what they saw that night," I said. Emma looked at me. Most people probably thought it was not their place to say anything. Her answer was immediate. And maybe they were right. But that does not mean they should stay quiet. I leaned back and studied her. In my world, people usually calculated every sentence before speaking. Every word had a purpose. Every action had a reason. Emma did not seem to operate that way. She considered the consequences first. Not the benefits. Not the attention. The consequences. That was rare. While I continued investigating the agreement, I discovered another problem. The issue was not just one overlooked detail. The process itself had become too comfortable. People had started trusting the reputation of the deal more than the details inside it. That realization bothered me because I knew exactly where that attitude came from. It came from me. I had built a system where people wanted to deliver perfect answers because they knew I expected perfect results. Somewhere along the way, they stopped bringing me difficult questions. They started bringing me confirmation. That was the moment I understood why Emma mattered. She was not powerful because she knew more than everyone else. She was powerful because she was willing to say something when everyone else stayed silent. But understanding that did not make everything easier. Some people around me questioned why I was listening to her. They saw her background before they saw her judgment. They saw a waitress standing near a business decision and assumed she had nothing valuable to offer. I noticed the same mistake happening again. People were judging the person before considering the truth. And that bothered me more than I expected. Later that evening, I returned to the restaurant where Emma worked. The place was busy, filled with conversations and the sound of coffee cups touching tables. She noticed me immediately. "You are here again," she said with a small smile. I nodded. "I wanted to thank you." She looked surprised. "For finding the problem?" I shook my head. "For reminding me that I do not see everything." Emma became quiet for a moment. Then she said something I would remember for a long time. The people who think they see everything are usually the ones who stop looking. I had heard many people try to teach me lessons. Advisors. Partners. People who wanted something from me. But Emma was different. She was not trying to change me. She was simply telling the truth as she saw it. And somehow, that made it impossible to ignore. I thought the hardest part would be uncovering the truth. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching people I trusted decide that protecting a reputation mattered more than admitting a mistake. After everything Emma had revealed, the agreement became more than a business problem. It became a test of loyalty, judgment, and the kind of person I wanted to be. For years, I had built my name around one belief. Never show uncertainty. Never let people see hesitation. A leader who doubts himself invites others to doubt him too. But that belief started to change when I realized my silence had been part of the problem. I had created an environment where people brought me solutions, but not concerns. They brought me confidence, but not questions. And now I was facing the consequences. The internal review continued for days. Every meeting became heavier than the one before. Some people wanted to move forward and forget the issue. They argued that the problem could be corrected quietly. They told me the damage would be limited if nobody made the situation bigger than it needed to be. But that was exactly the kind of thinking that created the problem in the first place. I looked across the table and asked a simple question. If Emma had not noticed it, would any of you have found it? Nobody answered. That silence told me everything. Later that afternoon, I asked Emma to meet me outside the office. I wanted to understand how she handled the pressure because I noticed something unusual. Everyone around me was trying to protect themselves. Emma was only trying to protect the truth. We sat in a quiet coffee shop a few blocks away from the building. It was a normal place, the kind of place where people talked about ordinary things. For a moment, I felt like I was seeing the world from a completely different perspective. "Are you upset?" Emma asked. I looked at her. Why would I be upset? She lowered her voice. Because I challenged your decision. Her honesty caught me off guard. Most people would have avoided saying that. I could have told her she was wrong. I could have reminded her about the difference between our worlds. Instead, I said the thing I rarely admitted. Because you were right. Emma looked away for a moment. She did not seem proud. She seemed tired. Being right does not always make things easier, she said. Sometimes people do not want the truth. They want the version of reality that makes them comfortable. Those words stayed with me. Because I realized Emma was not only talking about the agreement. She was talking about people. About the choices they make when admitting the truth becomes inconvenient. But the situation was already creating distance between us. Emma started questioning whether she should have spoken up at all. She told me some people at the restaurant had asked why she involved herself in something that had nothing to do with her. She wondered if her decision had caused more problems than it solved. Hearing that bothered me more than I expected. Not because I blamed her. Because I knew she had taken a risk by stepping into my world. And I had allowed her to carry the weight of that choice alone. For the first time, I understood that saying thank you was not enough. Respect was not enough. If I truly believed she had done the right thing, I had to prove it through my actions. The next morning, I made a decision that changed the direction of the entire situation. I stopped trying to save the image of a perfect agreement. I started searching for the reason it was never perfect to begin with. And that decision created a new problem. Because once you start looking for the truth, you cannot control what you might find. I used to believe that every problem had a solution if you had enough information. I learned that was not always true. Sometimes the hardest part was not finding the missing piece. It was accepting what that piece revealed about the people around you. After I made the decision to stop protecting the image of the agreement, everything changed. The review became deeper. The questions became harder. And the answers started pointing towards something I had not wanted to consider. The small inconsistency Emma found was not an isolated mistake. It was connected to a larger pattern of decisions made over time. Nothing was obvious. Nothing was simple. That was what made it dangerous. The agreement had been carefully prepared, but some of the information behind it had been presented in a way that created a false sense of security. The numbers looked complete. The reports looked organized. The presentations looked convincing. But beneath all of that was a weakness that nobody had taken the time to examine. I spent hours going through documents, speaking with advisors, and reviewing every step that led to my approval. The more I discovered, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because the problem existed. Problems could be solved. What bothered me was realizing how easily everyone had accepted something because they wanted it to be true. Including me. One evening, I called Emma to my office again. She walked in quietly, looking at the papers spread across my desk. This time, there was no surprise in her expression. There was concern. "You found more," she said. I nodded. "I found enough to know you were not just lucky." She looked down. I never wanted to be right about something like this. That sentence stayed with me. Because I understood what she meant. Discovering the truth was not always satisfying. Sometimes it meant realizing people had failed. Sometimes it meant admitting that your own judgment was not as perfect as you believed. I asked Emma what made her notice the detail when everyone else ignored it. She thought for a moment before answering. "I am used to watching people," she said. "When you work with customers every day, you learn that small things usually tell you the biggest stories." I looked at her differently in that moment. Before, I had seen her as someone who had interrupted an important meeting. Someone outside my world who had unexpectedly stepped into it. But I started to understand that she had a skill my world often forgot. She noticed human behavior. She noticed hesitation. She noticed when something did not match. Meanwhile, the pressure around me continued to grow. Some people wanted the investigation to end. They believed continuing would create unnecessary attention. Others quietly questioned why I was giving Emma so much credit. They still saw her position before they saw her ability. That bothered me. Not because they underestimated Emma. Because I realized I had done something similar at first. I had looked at her uniform before I looked at her insight. I had seen where she came from before understanding what she brought to the table. That realization was uncomfortable. But it was honest. Later that night, I stood alone in my office, looking over the city lights. For years, I had believed power meant having the best information, the best people, and the final decision. But Emma showed me something different. Power without awareness was just confidence wearing a different name. The next morning, I made another difficult choice. I decided to reveal everything we had discovered to the people involved, even if it created problems for me. Even if it meant admitting that my original judgment had been wrong. I expected that decision to bring clarity. Instead, it opened a new conflict. Because when the truth finally appears, not everyone is grateful to see it. The truth has a strange way of changing a room. Before people know it, they can sit together, speak the same words, and still feel like they are standing on opposite sides of something impossible to cross. That was exactly what happened after I revealed what we had discovered. I expected questions. I expected frustration. I expected difficult conversations. What I did not expect was how quickly people would try to separate themselves from responsibility. Suddenly, everyone had an explanation. Everyone had a reason why they did not notice the problem. Everyone remembered things differently. And somehow, the responsibility seemed to belong to everyone except them. I listened quietly. That was something I had learned to do over the years. The person who speaks the least often learns the most. But this time, silence was not enough. I had to make a choice. Protect the people who helped build my success, or protect the truth that could prevent a much larger failure. For the first time, those two things felt like they were moving in opposite directions. The decision affected everyone around me, but it affected Emma too. She became uncomfortable with the attention surrounding her. She never wanted recognition. She never wanted people to know her name. She simply saw something wrong and believed someone needed to say something. But now, because she spoke up, people were looking at her differently. Some respected her. Others questioned why I trusted her opinion. One evening, I found Emma outside the restaurant after her shift. The street was quiet, and the city felt completely different from the world I usually lived in. No meetings. No executives. No people waiting for my decision. Just two people standing under the same city lights. You should not have to deal with this, I said. Emma looked at me. Deal with what? People judging you because you told the truth. She was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, maybe they are not judging me. Maybe they are just uncomfortable because someone they did not expect to matter actually mattered. Her words were honest. Maybe too honest. But that was always Emma's way. She never tried to make the truth easier to hear. She simply delivered it. I wanted to tell her everything would be fine. I wanted to promise that I could fix the situation. Normally, I could. That was how my entire life worked. Problems appeared. I handled them. But this was different. Because the problem was not something outside of me. It was something I had allowed to exist. Do you regret saying something? I asked. Emma looked away. That pause answered before her words did. Sometimes, she admitted. Not because I think I was wrong. Because I wonder if things would have been easier if I stayed quiet. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. Because I realized the cost of doing the right thing had fallen on her shoulders. She had walked into a world that was not hers and carried a burden she never asked for. I had spent my life believing strength meant handling everything alone. But watching Emma lose confidence because she chose honesty forced me to reconsider what strength actually meant. The next day, I made a decision that surprised even the people closest to me. I publicly accepted responsibility for the mistake in the approval process. I did not blame the team. I did not blame circumstances. I accepted that the final decision had been mine. Some people disagreed. Some people thought admitting fault showed weakness. But I had started to understand something Emma knew from the beginning. Pretending to be perfect was not the same as being strong. That night, I returned to my office and looked at the contract that started everything. It was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a reminder. A reminder that the smallest details often reveal the biggest truths. And a reminder that sometimes the person who changes your perspective is the person you almost ignored. I thought accepting responsibility would end the hardest part of the situation. I was wrong. Taking responsibility was only the beginning. The real challenge was rebuilding trust after people realized that the image of perfection they believed in was never real. The agreement was no longer the center of the conversation. The people behind it were. In the weeks that followed, I changed the way I worked. I asked different questions. I listened longer. I stopped searching only for answers that supported my decisions and started looking for information that challenged them. It was uncomfortable. But discomfort was something I had avoided for too long. Emma noticed the change before anyone else did. She always noticed things people missed. One afternoon, she came to my office after finishing her shift. She stood near the doorway, looking at the same room where she had once entered as someone everyone underestimated. "Something is different," she said. I looked up from my desk. "Different how?" She looked around. "Before, this room felt like everyone was waiting for you to speak. Now it feels like people are waiting for you to listen." I did not have an immediate answer. Because she was right. For most of my life, I had measured leadership by control. By having the final word. By being the person everyone trusted to make the decision. But Emma showed me that leadership also required the courage to admit when someone else saw something you did not. The investigation eventually reached its conclusion. The agreement was adjusted, and the problems hidden inside it were corrected before they could create larger consequences. The situation that once threatened my reputation became the reason I changed the way my organization operated. But the biggest change was not written in any document. It happened between people. I started noticing how others felt around me. I started asking why someone hesitated before speaking. I started paying attention to the quiet voices in the room. The voices that were usually ignored. One evening, I met Emma at the same coffee shop where we had talked during the most difficult days. The place was small, warm, and completely different from the spaces where I usually made decisions. She sat across from me with a cup of coffee in her hands. "Do you think things would have been different if I never noticed it?" she asked. I thought about the question carefully. "Yes," I said. "Everything would have been different." Emma looked down at her coffee. "That is a lot of pressure for one small observation." I nodded. "Maybe. But sometimes the smallest observations create the biggest changes." She smiled slightly. Not because she wanted praise. Because she understood what I meant. Emma never wanted to become important in my world. She simply wanted people to stop ignoring what mattered. That was the difference between us from the beginning. I had spent years building influence. She had spent years building awareness. I knew how to make people notice me. She knew how to notice people. And somehow, that became the lesson I needed most. Before Emma entered my life, I believed the person with the most power had the clearest view of the world. Now I understood something completely different. Sometimes the person standing farthest from the center can see what everyone around it has forgotten to look for. The situation changed my decisions. It changed my organization. But more than anything, it changed the way I saw strength. Strength was not never making a mistake. Strength was being willing to learn from the person who found it. I used to think the moments that changed a person were always dramatic. A major victory. A life-changing decision. A moment everyone could see coming. But looking back now, I understand that the most important changes often arrive quietly. They begin with a small question. A simple observation. A person brave enough to say something when everyone else chooses silence. Months had passed since the agreement was corrected, but I still thought about that night in Manhattan. Not because of the mistake. Not because of the consequences. I thought about it because it was the moment I realized I had spent years building a world where people were afraid to challenge me. I had created success, but I had also created distance. Emma was the person who crossed that distance without even realizing it. She never tried to impress me. She never asked for anything. She never looked at my position and decided that my opinion mattered more than hers. She simply saw something important and chose honesty over comfort. That was something I respected more every day. My life before Emma was built around measurements. Numbers. Results. Agreements. Decisions. Everything had a value. Everything had a purpose. But Emma reminded me that not everything important could be calculated. Trust could not be measured on a spreadsheet. Courage could not be written into a contract. And sometimes the smallest act of honesty could create the biggest change. I continued visiting the restaurant where she worked. At first, she seemed surprised every time I appeared. Eventually, she stopped asking why I was there. We would talk about ordinary things. The weather. The city. Small moments from our days. It was strange for me. I was used to conversations that always had an objective. A negotiation. A reason. With Emma, there was no hidden agenda. She was simply present. One evening, as we sat near the window, she looked at me and said, "You know, I never expected any of this to happen." I smiled slightly. Neither did I. She looked outside at the passing cars. "I only noticed a mistake." I shook my head. "No. You noticed something everyone else stopped looking for." She became quiet. Then she said, "Maybe people miss things because they are too focused on what they expect to see." That sentence reminded me of everything that had changed. I had spent years expecting people to see me as someone who always had the answer. Emma saw something different. She saw a person who was still learning. The agreement that once represented certainty became a reminder that certainty could be dangerous when it stopped people from asking questions. The mistake that embarrassed my organization became the reason we built a better system. The person everyone underestimated became the person who changed the way we thought. But the greatest lesson was not about business. It was about people. I learned that power does not come from being the person everyone listens to. Real power comes from being willing to listen when someone unexpected speaks. Emma did not change my world by entering it with authority. She changed it by bringing something my world had forgotten. Perspective. Even now, when I look back at that moment, I remember the quiet room, the unfinished conversations, and the small detail hidden among thousands of words. But the thing I remember most is Emma standing there, holding a piece of paper that everyone else had ignored. She was not trying to prove she was smarter than anyone else. She was simply trying to make sure nobody made a decision without seeing the whole truth. And that is the lesson I carry with me. The person who changes your life is not always the person with the most power. Sometimes, it is the person who has the courage to show you what you were never willing to see.